opium and good neighbors. How Solovyov justifies the current war by rewriting the history of Britain and Europe. How Russian propaganda explains Ukrainian sabotage and Europe's failure. In this episode of Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, Russian propaganda demonstrates a characteristic set of techniques: collectivizing accusations against Ukraine and the UK, delegitimizing the Ukrainian leadership, ridiculing European politicians, and claiming that US-Russia negotiations will essentially determine Ukraine's future. For European readers, it's useful to consider how these arguments are constructed and what purposes they serve. 1. Ukraine as the universal culprit of all sabotage. In the first part of the excerpt, Solovyov lists a number of events: strikes on ships in Turkish waters, the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline, attacks on infrastructure in the Black Sea, and attributes responsibility for each to Ukraine. The logic is simple: no evidence, it could have been Ukraine. There is evidence, it could still have been Ukraine. And if it's inconvenient to blame someone else, it's also Ukraine. This creates the image of a proxy state, one that's not a pity and conveniently used as cover. This simultaneously deflects responsibility from Russia and shifts blame to Kyiv, creating the illusion of international chaos, allegedly triggered by Ukrainian terrorism, but in reality described in a way that coincides with Moscow's interests. 2. Expanding the accusations from Ukraine to the UK. The next step is shifting the focus to London. Britain is declared the curator of Ukrainian operations, a historical pirate power, a weak link in NATO, whose infrastructure lies at the bottom of the sea and can be destroyed. This is a broader strategic objective: to portray the UK as the source of a threat to global security rather than Russia, which is effectively waging war. The British connection is being used to undermine trust in Western unity, create the impression that NATO is incapable of defending its own countries, show that Ukraine's allies are themselves jeopardizing global trade. Well, how convenient, huh? Who attacked the transport vessels sailing under some foreign flags in Turkish territorial waters? Ukraine. Who blew up the Nord Streams? Ukraine. Who blew up then the oil pipeline from Novorossiysk? Yes, Ukraine. And who are those moving around Africa then? Other tankers? Well, the main suspicion, who? Ukraine. Well, how convenient. A country that no one gives a damn about. A country that isn't afraid of being destroyed. A country that can be targeted by hundreds of missiles and everything else because it's not needed for nothing. And exposing it is very convenient. At the same time, you see, we understand perfectly well that Britain is somewhere beyond. And its ears keep popping up there. Britain, a country on an island, which depends on the transport supplies of ships. Yes, it would seem that it should be very dangerous, but along the bottom there passes the traffic flow, internet communications, and supplies of electricity, gas, oil, and everything else. 3. Europe as an accomplice to corruption and as a political deceiver. Solovyov analyzes Western publications about Yermak in detail, reinforcing the key thesis. Europe knew about the corruption, but turned a blind eye for the sake of its own interests. This thesis accomplishes several goals. 1. Undermine European audiences' trust in their own governments. 2. Portray the EU as a participant in Ukrainian abuses, not an observer. 3. Pave the way for accusations against the West of deliberately exploiting Ukraine. What follows is a classic ploy, ridiculing individual European politicians, Callas, Macron, Starmer, and their statements to create the impression of chaotic and inadequate European leadership. 4. Negotiations as a secret process of the elite and an attempt to rewrite the meaning of events. A significant section of the program is devoted to the US-Ukraine-Russia negotiations. It is emphasized. Only a few know the substantive part of the negotiations. Leaks are impossible. Otherwise, there will be harsh consequences for the Ukrainian participants. Europeans play the role of independent observers, but do not make decisions. The main thing is to return Ukraine to its real status before 2014. This creates the feeling the elites are negotiating behind closed doors, Europe is excluded, Ukraine is not a subject, Russia is the only rational participant. This construction serves a central purpose, to demonstrate that the outcome of the war will be determined neither in Kiev nor in Brussels, but in direct contact between the US and Russia, where Washington is supposedly forced to accept Russian conditions. Think, analyze, draw conclusions, and don't be fooled. This was the program Empire of Lies.